I'm Rina Bliss, and I'm a professor at Rutgers University, which is in New Jersey. And I am also a mom of three young kids, and I live in Princeton, New Jersey. I I guess the most important thing to this conversation is that I'm an expert in genetic science. I'm a sociologist, and I try to, with my books and my research, kind of translate for the public what new genetic sciences are telling us, what we're learning from studying the genome. And it's funny to say the genome because it's really like all these genomes. There's so many genomes, and we're learning a lot from not just studying humans, but also studying plants and animals, and we're also learning what we don't know yet, which is kind of part of what I write into my books and where I kind of started with the book that we're talking about today, What's Real About Race.
Well, and thank you for the book because it's very clear-eyed and very readable. And I think for the layperson, the science is there, but it doesn't get into some of the mathematics and some of all of that matter to why it's real. But you do a very good job of laying out the history of race and also of these different um, projects that are trying to grapple with the human genome. So could you talk to us first about why you chose to write this book and why race was so important to this story?
Well, I have actually been interested in race my whole life. I'm a multiracial, multi-ethnic person, and my mom comes from Indonesia. My dad comes from America, but his ancestors, recent ancestors, actually come from Eastern Europe and from Western, Northwestern Europe. And my parents are both mixed in their own ways. If we think of race as kind of like continental variation, which is the way it's been sold to us since basically hundreds of years, for hundreds of years, then, they are mixed, multi-ethnic, mixed in their own ways. And so yeah, I was always interested in race from a personal standpoint because I noticed that even though as a child I was being told that races were different from each other and that there were kind of like discrete differences that couldn't be reconciled in a way, I knew from my own existence that like there was no such thing as just discrete races. And I also followed my interest into college, followed this lead in, so to speak, just this like passion about understanding race. When I got to college, I started to study it from a sociological perspective, which basically tells us that race is a social construct, something that we make together as a society to make sense of the differences that we see. And I want to stop and just say that there are differences. It's undeniable that we all look different from one another, but there's a history to classifying those differences by continents, and that's something that we can get into in a little bit. But anyways, my interest, kept just growing through college. And then when I was in grad school, I ended up doing my dissertation on the relationship between race and genetics, and specifically the Human Genome Project and the leaders of the project and the subsequent projects that we've had. And that became my first book, which was called Race Decoded. And so I just looked at like how these leaders understood human difference and what they thought about race and what was different between their concepts of human difference in genetic science or genomic science, because at that point we were studying genomes. And then I wrote another book that was called Social by Nature that was on kind of this new area, at least, about 10 years ago, new area of genomic research that looked at human behavior. And in that book, I also kind of was thinking about like, we're studying now like things like genes associated with, uh, criminal behavior, genes associated with defaulting on credit cards, like or loans, or just all kinds of new behaviors, and also how far you get in school. That was a big one, or is a big one, I should say. And so I talked a little bit, looked a little bit about at how those scientists were thinking about race, um, and then I wrote another book called Rethinking Intelligence. That was my first book for the general public. So anyone who likes what's real about race, please go see that book. And that was looking at intelligence genomics. So, like where we're at with intelligence. And of course, that included a history of race and intelligence and the relationship. When I came to the end of writing that book and just finishing that and releasing that into the world, I really wanted to write something that was really a summation of all the things that I had learned about race, but also I wanted to talk a little bit about new avenues in the sciences. So that's why I came to write this book, What's Real About Race. I just thought the one thing that people probably could use right about now, and I didn't even know how much we were going to need it, because it was like most of writing this book happened before regime change and all of that stuff. But basically, I thought people really need to just understand what's real and what's not real about race. So that's why I came to write this book.
And I think that'll be the final question I ask you is what's real about race? But before we get into that, uh,
Mhm.
before we get to that, I'd love for you to, because you begin the book with a very good overview of how science has gotten race
Mhm.
wrong, and also how its science has defined race because, or created it, I guess is a better word for it, what I'm getting at. And so could you kind of walk us through, to hit everybody, but the major
Yeah.
points of how we got race introduced into our culture the way it exists today.
Absolutely. So in the book, I talk about these four kind of historical moments. I call them paradigms, but I can just, for the ease of explanation right now, just call them these historical periods. And the first is the origin of our concept of race, which is in the Enlightenment period. So hundreds of years ago again. And this is before we had modern science or the science of biology or any of like the academic disciplines that we think about today in terms of science. This is back when people were just writing about what they saw, but didn't necessarily collect any data or what they heard. In the case of race, it was mostly what they heard because the big thinkers of the time were people like Immanuel Kant, David Hume, Linnaeus, like is another name that people might recognize. And also some people that we might not have as household names like Blumenbach or Bernier but basically these main thinkers of the Enlightenment period were also talking about race. And what they did was they said, from what we've heard from travelers' tales, most of them hadn't even left their hometown or necessarily left Europe or anything like that, but like they were just saying like what, or if they had gone to like one place nearby, um, maybe Central Asia or something like that. And so what they had heard from people coming back from going through colonialism, going to other continents, is that continents each had their own species in a sense, and I say species because again, this was before Darwin, so it's kind of like hard to imagine what they were thinking exactly. But Kant actually taught a class about anthropology, about race and things like that. And so we know that they really did think there was something very fixed about continental differences. And that was the birth of race. In the next kind of period, which I write about as being sparked with Darwinian evolution and just Darwin himself traveling the world. So that was like a new thing to like just go yourself and collect data, find out like what are people like and and based on his ideas, like he had this notion of evolution and of people passing on their whatever was inside of them to their offspring. and of all, all beings as being related in some way, shape, or form, and humans as all being one species. So the interesting thing about that period, and I call that the modern period, because we actually have the rise of the sciences and we have the rise of modern genetics, is that it was really his cousin, Francis Galton, who got us started on thinking about racial differences in terms of behavior. And so that was like a big, and in terms of genetics. And so that was like a big shift. And what he said was basically like, those continental differences that we heard about, those are absolutely real. And we can see that in genes. Now, his way of collecting data was really suspect, or as my kids would say, sus. Um, so he basically had this lab that he created in Hyde Park in London, and he, started to do things like take case histories of twins, or talk about, write about and learn about, interview maybe like different people who are members of kind of England's ruling class and London's high society, and then spin out these stories of how their genes justified their power, right? And so the real kind of birth of the field of genetics was really heavily shaped by his notion. And he came up with this idea of eugenics, of controlled breeding, and making sure that the people who supposedly had the best genes on Earth would be able to breed, and the people who had the worst genes on Earth. And again, this was, seen in terms of class initially, and then also, ethnicity. And then later he really talked about race, and about that continental difference. But, that like basically we need to breed out of existence all of the unwanted, undesirable people. And he really thought of like, Africa as being like the most undesirable place with the most undesirable people. And then, Europeans and Europe being like the place of like legitimate genetic value, right? And then, so that's the modern period. I talk about how after and that really like kind of motivated the eugenics movement that was really active here in the US. And then also it motivated a really strong movement in places like England and Germany, and in Europe. And so with that, we had the rise of Nazism, Nazi racial science, which they called, racial hygiene or Rassenhygiene, and so with that, we had like, just the horrors of Nazi science. Now, after the war, World War II ended, and Americans started to become aware of that science, there was a backlash. And here in the States and in Europe, but especially here in the States, there was a movement to kind of expel the science of eugenics, or at least to the racial kind of connotations of that science. And so, so one of the main things that our government did here in the US was to help the UN and the UN's education, science, cultural organization, so the UNESCO, to pull together all of these scientists who could write a new kind of definition of race. And I call that the UNESCO period, even though it's really like just basically the post-war period. In the post-war period, we saw 50s and 60s, we saw, these statements, new statements. They were supposed to give us a global awareness of the inadequacy of the former notions of race, and a kind of alternative vision of how we could define race. Problem was that those same, or not same, but like those scientists who were pulled into this job were anthropologists mostly, and evolutionary biologists, scientists who focus on genetics, but who basically agreed that there were no hierarchies between races, but they didn't challenge the idea of continental races being real or accurate. Like that part of it stayed intact. So that period, you know, it was a lot shorter when genomic science came to exist. And, basically that happened because we had better microscopes, better technologies, and ways of mapping, not just, following individual genes as they move through different families, but like we started to be able to actually look at different genes and strands of genes, strands of pieces of the genome essentially. And we really started to be able to like compare, okay, here are these chunks and here are these other chunks and here are these, and they seem to be coming from here, and these other ones seem to be coming from this other part of the world. Um, I call that the genomic period. When the genomic period arose, it was like basically we still had this notion of finite continental differences. So, um, yeah, I think I'll stop there and let you, kind of ask me what you want to know about that period, or, just in general, the relationship between those periods.
Yeah, and thank you for the overview, and that was perfect. And I think it we won't go back to the 1600s or the even the 1860s because that's pretty unpacked. But
Right.
what I find interesting in what you do a very good job of doing is showing how even though there's this idea emerging that there
Mhm.
is one human race with these slight differences of skin tone or whatever,
Yeah.
the hierarchy doesn't exist anymore. That you can't completely get away from race, and it just keeps kind of adapting and moving itself back into the conversation, back into the literature, back into the science. So I think just in the modern period where the horrors of eugenics
Mhm.
trans transfer, not transfer, but as that period moves into the modern period, how has
Yeah.
that been negotiated and how has race maintained itself in that negotiation?
Well, one of the questions that I get at almost every, event that I do for this book and just in general, whenever I talk about race and genetics, the relationship between the two, is like, but I see race, and so I think that there has never really been an adequate conversation, public conversation about what it means to see race. And so I think that, we want to believe that scientists are unbiased and that they're giving us like just the facts, ma'am, kind of. But that's just not the case because scientists also are, uh, yeah, I mean, I hate to say biased, but they are, they're conditioned, right? Just like all of us, we're all conditioned by um, this feeling that seeing is believing, and we do see differences. That's why I wrote this book, actually, was just to be able to talk about somewhat about the history, somewhat about the sociology of race, which I spend time with, somewhat about the psychology of race, which I spend time with in the book as well. And then also to just address like what it means to see race and what is different about what we see and what's under the surface, right? And that's all the genetic and genomic stuff, right? But so I think that these scientists who had the best intentions and really like did want to eradicate racism, they still, something I mentioned in the book is like this concept of racialism, which is a little bit different than racism. Racism is like where you actually think there's a hierarchy of value amongst the races. But racialism is just that you believe that they exist, and that could be like, just, yeah, there are continental differences. There are groupings that we can create around these genetic differences. Um, and because I believe that it's because people and scientists themselves never really questioned that premise, that we still have the racialism embedded in genomic race, which, if you talk to genetic scientists and especially the leaders of all of our, big and scientific endeavors like genome projects, as I have done, they don't want people to believe that there are genetic races. They don't want people to buy into that, you know. They are like, no, we're the first people who will tell you that that is completely false, you know. But the fact is that we still, you know, have an idea circulating around that there are these groupings, and that, you know, like what you see is somehow reflected in our genetics under the skin. And what I talk about in the book is that that's not true. That's absolutely not true.
And I think too, what I would like to unpack the shift from the hierarchy to the continents, because you're
Yeah.
alluding to it, and I think we need to really elaborate on that, because I think it speaks to where we kind of get stuck. And
Hmm.
it's that seeing the object of a human
Hmm.
body looking different from other human bodies, and why
Right.
we need to classify that at all. So let's talk about the UNESCO and the, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, with the UNESCO period, you know, and that kind of the efforts of world leading scientists to come together and write a new, they literally called them the UNESCO statements on race, you know. So it's like they were like, this is the global planetary like new definition of race. I think that those scientists, they basically were like, race is a zoological concept. It's like we can call it subspecies. That's what Darwin called it, and that's what we should call it. Races are kind of like how we talk about races of dogs, right? So it's like there are just different varieties. And a species is something that, you know, is defined by its inability to breed with another species. All humans can interbreed. So obviously, like we're not, you know, different species, but we are subspecies, which means that there are like these like very clear clusters of difference. And they do correspond to these geographical, you know, terms we call the continents, right? Um, so the that kind of maintaining that continental race, you know, a notion is what slid us into the place where we're at now, which is just, you know, where we have, I think, a general sense in the world and in science of it's a kind of disposition of anti-racism. So wanting to fight the idea of that hierarchy between the groups, but kind of a staunch racialism, like I was just talking about, where we still believe that there is some truth to the clustering. Um, and you know, the reason why I say that what we see isn't exactly what's underneath the skin is that what we see is we see continental variation, right? So we see something called black, something called white, something called, you know, back in the day they called it red, but we call it Asian. I mean, we call it American or Indigenous American. And back in the day they called it yellow, but we call it Asian, right? And then Oceania, you know, a different like, you know, brown Pacific Islander, what, you know, so basically like um, we see those things as being kind of facts of our existence. And actually, the variation that we focus on when we see are things like skin tone, right? The tone, the color, hair texture, um, facial features, like differences in like the shape of a nose or the shape of an eye, you know, shape of eyelids, like things like that. Also, yeah, just kind of like there are just so many things that we see, and then we clock in like, oh, that person's black and that person's white. And it's true that all of that human variation has a, you know, kind of not all of it, but like much of it has some kind of root in our genetics, you know, and so, but there, all that variation is actually clinal, meaning that it's gradual across the planet. And so, you know, people who are raced differently socially, right, who we call, you know, different races, are can have the exact same skin tone, right? And can have the same eye shape and can have the same nose shape. And so, it's our social practice to see the continental difference as being like, this is what a Black person looks like. This is what a white person looks like. But actually, if you break it down to like the genetic, causes of those differences, um, these different gene variants, or what geneticists call alleles, that those are shared across the planet, and that there's no like gene for hair texture that isn't shared amongst all the different races. So like it's kind of a tricky move to make in your mind, but if I feel like if people understand that what they're seeing is variation, but it's not continentally distinct, right? And if, I think I give an example of indigenous people in um, like, basically like Siberia having the similar or same kind of skin tone to people in an equatorial part of the world, right? It's like when we realize that, then we are able to kind of move away from this continental kind of schematic that we've been trapped in. So yeah, I want people to understand that, like, yes, you do see variation, and yes, it is tied to your genetics, but the genetics isn't saying like now we should draw a bright line around these continents, right? Like we all share these alleles, and and we could, if we retrain the way that we see and think about what we see, then we can get away from that basic lie that we've been sold on since the Enlightenment period.
Yeah, and as I was reading the book, I was thinking of it as like English accents, where
Mhm.
we're all speaking English, but the South has a twang, the Midwest has a drawl, and the British have a distinct way, but it's all the same language. And
Yeah.
so you could make distinctions by saying that people who speak this way exhibit these characteristics, but it's not
Mhm.
true based on the way they're speaking English.
Right. And also, like, it's a good analogy because there is that's also a gradual kind of variation, right? So it's like people in different parts of England will have different accents, but it's also, that's also like driven by the environment as well, just like genes are, right? So it's kind of like, and there's no like place that you could go and draw a bright line around one accent or even a dialect, because those people are also talking to the other people in English and sharing, right? So it's a good analogy. Yeah.
So before we get into the structural and implicit bias of what we're talking about, let's get into the nitty-gritty of what these human genome projects are, what they set out to do, and what they accomplished.
Yeah, so in the beginning, the Human Genome Project, that's like the first one, right? So that was started in 1986 and then completed in 2003. And and that project was just trying to stitch together a like a complete human genome. They used many samples from all over the world, but basically settled on, certain kind of snippets of DNA from certain people who had donated their DNA, right? And so, and they just stitched together, not thinking about, the race or the even like the ethnic background or any or the even geographical background of the people who contributed DNA. It was just like, what do we have in the collections? What is proving to be robust when we, run the experiments that we need to run and figure out like how to like stitch together a complete genome. And so, that was kind of the 90s version of a genome project. In the 90s, though, there was a big shift in US kind of public health where we started to use racial categories that the government had developed for things like affirmative action, for monitoring, racial practices in hiring, racist practices in hiring, I should say, and employment. And so basically, uh, science and all that field of genomics that was just emerging at the time started to be affected by this mandate to use these categories and start to like basically collect DNA from as many people as possible, but also pay attention to the race of who you are collecting DNA from. And so um, that shift happened in the early 90s, and by the end of the Human Genome Project, the leaders of that project were invested in thinking about how to get more people involved in genomic research. Also, like scientists, to recruit more minoritized scientists, people of color, but also like to think about like how can we get more people of color in the US and around the world to participate in our research. And so that we're not just basically stitching together a bunch of European genomes and then telling all these people in the US about everything as if, we know what genomics looks like for everybody in the world. And so that shift happened again, in the 90s, but like really like the main way that you can see it is through the second kind of spin-off project of the Human Genome Project, which was called the International HapMap Project. And that looked at these chunks of DNA called haplotypes. And, basically with that project, the leaders of that project, which were some of the leaders of the Human Genome Project and some other people who were heavily involved in the Human Genome Project, and then some new folks. But basically, they said, like, let's go ahead and make sure to cover each continent. And so we're going to have a group sampled from each continent that will stand in as the people of that race, basically. And so that ended up being when all is said and done, it was like a group from Africa, two groups from Asia that were smushed together to become the Asian samples, and then from, US, Europe, basically, um, you know, to get like a European or, in a sense, white sample. And those three groups were kind of posited as being different from one another. And for many years, and still today, like you can use these samples and do research on them. But because they were classified for so long as being different from one another, when researchers around the world who were working with, this wonderful, um, you know, resource of genetic material to do all kinds of research into cancer, into heart disease, into like what have you, any of these diseases that we want to find cures for. They were like basically locked into this racial schematic. And so in the that project started in 2002, 2003, got going in 2003. And, it like, and if after a few years, they were like, you know what, we have this new technology that's called whole genome sequencing, where we can just look at the whole genome of a given individual. And so now we want to do a 1,000 genomes project where we sequence the whole genome of 1,000 individuals. And again, they went with this kind of continental sampling model where they were like, we're going to make sure we get people from here and from there and from this and from that. And again, like stored the DNA in like, these groupings. And so I think that things have changed a lot. That project got underway in like, 2007, 2008. But like, I think that this is the kind of thing where, now today, all of those projects ended up collecting DNA from many, many more groupings. And, so it's like, it's not like the research has been completely stuck at the continental level, but it has kind of systematically made its way through medical research such that we do think of these groups as being genetically, genomically distinct. And so in the book, I talk about genomic racialism and say that this is something that we have to be very concerned about, and we need to, struggle against, which is the idea that not that like races are better or worse than one another, but that they're just genomically true. It's just a genomic fact that, we have these continental groups and they're genomically distinct, And so, yeah, I think that that's how we've gotten to basically maintain through UNESCO onto the genomic period, like this idea of genomic races being real, despite, again, the fact that the people who have led these projects have really spoken out against the notion of race.
And just to be clear, because it is a little confusing, when you talk about these continental groupings and the distinct genomes that they have, we're talking about very small differences, correct? Like the majority of it is the same across
Mhm.
human human experience wherever you live. 90 more than 90% of it is the same. So we're talking about very small, kind of inconsequential differences, correct?
Well, the interesting thing is that scientists who like do DNA collection, they're not thinking about what the genome shows at that point where they're collecting DNA. At the point where they're collecting DNA, they're thinking, how do we include these social groups who have been excluded? So there's been a history of, as many genome scientists point out, Eurocentrism, which is like the idea of us, not the idea, but the historical fact of us focusing on European bodies and European issues and European, priorities and all of that stuff. And then as a result, like collecting data only on European people or people who believe themselves to be of European descent, right? And so that is something that genome scientists have been fighting against since, the 80s, basically. And the idea is that, if we can get more people from other parts of the world and other, and even within the US from, minoritized groups like African Americans and Asian Americans and whatnot, if we can get people into the fold of research, then we'll know more about how to help cure the diseases that affect them, right? And but the issue is that, in going and using a certain kind of schematic to sample DNA, what I argue in this book and just have been arguing for a while is just that, we don't need to use that same schematic in the research process after that point, right? So we can go out and be like, I want to include formerly excluded groups or presently excluded groups. And I can, say like, we need to have more Black Americans in the sample, right? But at the same time, we don't have to say like, okay, now I'm going to like stamp these samples with the term Black because the people who we recruited called themselves Black or, said that they presented and said like, I am Black, we can also just like do what many scientists who do collect their own DNA do, which is just to say like, these are the samples that we have, and now we can start studying them. And it's true that certain groups can have higher frequencies of diseases. And so if we know that information, we can focus our research on those groups. But there are no diseases that belong to a race, right? And so like when you look at diseases that have a higher prevalence in one community, there's usually a genetic and an environmental reason for that. And so like we can say, okay, in the US, West Africans, people of West African and Central African descent have a higher chance of having sickle cell anemia or a thalassemia Um, but if you leave the US, that kind of grouping doesn't help you because the highest rates are in, populations in equatorial regions, and that includes like places like India, and it includes places like, Italy and Greece, and so basically you have to like think, where am I? Where are the people who are most affected by a disease? And when we look at like those groups of people who are affected by a disease, have a higher prevalence, we find that that is like at a very minor ethnic kind of level. And so we don't see that like, any continental group, having their own diseases, and like meaning having their own property of that group, kind of, yeah. So so yeah, if we want to focus on a group, we need to make sure that we're focusing on that group and not everybody who we call Black, right?
Yeah, it makes sense, but it's a long walk for it to make sense, which I think is some of the confusion about why it it is still seen as confusing. But I want to talk now about the structural and implicit biases and some of the pushback. I was really fascinated by Ami and Winat and their work, but you speak about other people too and how they've kind of, not kind of, they have pushed back and made clear some of the things that we've been struggling to describe here. So could you talk about their work and the influence it's had and how it's affected the work of the genome projects and different scientific endeavors?
Well, yeah, so Omi and Wynan are sociologists, and I talk about different sociologists' work in the book, and what they're kind of, I just want to like kind of sum it up as, their work being about about that social construction process and how that happens through political experiences. And so the main takeaway from that kind of part of my research, and what the research that I represent, I should say, because it's the work of these brilliant scholars. And so basically what they tell us and what they show us with their research is that because we take these categories, which are lies, right, and we teach people and force people also and instruct people to see through the lens of race and continental difference. And because for centuries we've used that system to justify enslavement, to justify colonization, to justify genocide, all of that kind of, and research biases and all of the heinous things we've done with research. Because we've done that for so long, the people who have been affected by that have come to share political and social experiences in a way that now is so implicit that we ourselves don't even know when we're doing it most of the time. And also our systems are still doing it to all of us, right? And sorting us. And also, we basically, there is something true about the groupness at this point, because given that different, like we could just focus on America for now, and our continental, kind of translation of the continental race thing here. It's like now we do have Indigenous American issues that are different from Black American issues and experiences. And those are also different from, Asian American issues. And I can go on and on, but basically we have different sets of experiences. They're also like commonalities among the racism that affects all of these groups, but there are specific kind of experiences. And so now there's a truth. This is the crazy part. There's a truth, a reality to race. And that reality is these social experiences that bring these members of these groups together. And so I know that kind of gets to your last question, but anyways, I can re-explain that part of it in a moment. But like the thing to take away from the sociologist kind of analysis is that like everything in society is kind of still forcing us to think through the lens of the lie. And at this point, there's a truth that has come out of it that is powerful and meaningful and really like determines for many people what kind of treatment they'll get at school and then what kind of jobs they'll get and what kind of people they'll be exposed to and what kind of people they'll want to marry and get or just like cohabitate with or have children with and all of these things. So it's like at this point there's a social reality that we can't deny. That's on the sociology side of it. I also talk about psychology and implicit bias and how that's part of this whole thing because sociologists tend to focus at this level of like major institutions of society like healthcare and housing and things like that, but the psychology piece is important because it is part of the reason why we can't stop seeing race and why we can't stop believing it's true. And that's because we have these implicit biases that we're not even aware of. And the research there, which also has kind of, come to us over many decades at this point, is just that we, even when we don't hold explicit biases, we still tend to hold implicit biases. And so the very people who started us understanding about implicit biases, they started with themselves, literally started with themselves, and were like, looking at their own implicit biases. And then, now it's been like decades of research, and we know that like children have these biases. People who are members of a minoritized group have these biases against themselves, so it's kind of like the reality of the social reality of race is something that's also inside of us in a way that we have to again like work through and retrain ourselves to see differently and to think differently so that we can work on these implicit biases and route them out.
And I want to end on where there's a very interesting part of the book where you talk about how all of this is being weaponized by those who would still want to be virulent racists and
Yeah.
make sure that white supremacy succeeds. And this isn't the structural kind. This is very much an intentional setting out to make sure the old eugenics and all those kind of bad stereotypes are not only maintained, but proven in the data that we are saying disproves them. So could you talk about how those people are doing it and why they're still successful?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, as we've seen in the last few months, we're recording this in 2025, in like late spring of 2025. But like, what we've seen is that white nationalism is on the rise around the world, and that there are governments all over the world that are voting white nationalists, or people who have really close ties to white nationalists into power. And so, and in the US, there's a resurgence of white nationalism, and it's almost becoming something that is like more legitimized by the powers that be than anti-racism. So it's kind of like racism is having a resurgence around the world. And one of the things that I talk about is how genetic ancestry tests have really helped a lot of white nationalists feel legitimate about their politics and their beliefs, right? And so they take these tests and then they're like, yeah, look how European I am, and look how, I have these alleles and not these other ones. And so I'm so like intelligent and so great and whatnot. And sadly, also there have been people who have taken the research that exists to the extreme of committing mass violence, right? And so I think that that is a horrible way of exposing to us how research doesn't always lead to enlightenment and to better awareness of what we are as human beings, how research is often misappropriated, misused. And there are also white nationalist researchers. So unfortunately, there are geneticists out there, or genome scientists who are like forming a new eugenics that is just based on like the latest in genomic science. And that's why I wrote the book Rethinking Intelligence, was because I was noticing that IQ genomics was becoming a thing, back in like the basically in the last 10 years, and so and that all of these things are kind of bubbling up to the surface. One of the things that has changed a lot in the last few years, which is another reason why I felt like writing this book now, is now you can go into a clinic, not tons of clinics, but at this moment you still can, if you want to, go into a clinic and basically there are places that will help you use IVF to select for an implant and carry to term and basically birth humans that are supposedly selected for higher intelligence and supposedly selected against undesirable kind of traits. And so yeah, it's like basically I think that and that is eugenics, right? It's kind of like a shift in eugenics. But I think that what we're learning from what's going on now with the white nationalism and with the new eugenics is that there isn't like an innocent part of this whole enterprise, right? Like we have to be really careful with how we operationalize research and how we bring it into the clinic and how we teach kids in school. And right now, I do think that there is a lot of interest from, again, like powers that be, to kind of change education and of course get rid of anything DEI, but also it's kind of like to abolish like the sense um of of anti-racism that we have been trying to work into the education system. And yeah, schools are feeling it and communities are feeling it. And I think that we need to understand how race and the false belief in its roots in genetics, how that plays a role in what this future that we're setting up for our kids.